Hi, and welcome to the Punk CX podcast. My name is Adrian Swinsko, and I'm an advisor, best-selling author, speaker, and general explorer when it comes to customer and employee experience. I'm really interested in figuring out what it takes to build organizations that produce better outcomes for both customers and employees. So with that in mind, I seek out and interview CEOs, entrepreneurs, business and tech leaders, authors and academics to uncover some clues about what it takes to build such an organization. Now, some of you may know the podcast as the Rare Business Podcast, but I decided to rename and rebrand the podcast recently. This is for a number of reasons. First one was to mirror the title of my book Punk CX, which was published in June 2019. 2, because I'm a fan of punk music. And 3, it's just more fun, right? Anyway, if this is your first time listening to one of these interviews, then hello and welcome. And please do dive into the archives at adrianswinsko.com, as I've now completed over 300 of these interviews in the last few years. If this is not your first time listening, then welcome back and thank you. Anyway, that's enough from me right now. Let's get into the interview. Before we get into the interview, I just want to say a big thank you to the folks at Pegasystems for sponsoring my podcast for the coming few weeks. You can join Pega from October the 7th for a series of free online events that are focused on shaping the future of business and designing today's tech to solve for tomorrow's challenges. Now, whether your focus is one-to-one customer engagement, customer service, or intelligent automation, there's going to be a virtual event tailored just for you. You'll be able to watch live demos and hear inspiring stories from world-leading organizations in a time zone that suits you. So, go to pega.com and search for Discover, and you will quickly and easily find the event page where you will be able to register for free. I'll see you there. Now, let's get into the interview. So welcome to the next edition of the Punk CX podcast. With me today, I have Alison McDougall, who is the Senior Vice President, no less, of Global Revenue at Amplexor. And she is also, I'm very pleased to add, a fellow punk. Hey, Alison, how you doing?
Hello, Adrian. Such a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
You're very, 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 very welcome. So, Alison, for the benefit of our listeners, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself and also about the work that you do over at Amplexor?
Sure, thanks for the opportunity. In a rather large nutshell, I'm part of a $45 billion, what we would call cottage industry, dedicated to helping companies succeed in the global marketplace. So Amplexor, I represent a $170 million Luxembourg-based company that helps companies across diverse industry sectors. So when you think about high tech, life sciences, retail, manufacturing, financial services, etc., they all have a need to engage their global audiences, ready a product for the global marketplace or for their global users, if you will, and ensure a personal customer experience, regardless of where those customers are. Regardless of language, regardless of channels where they're interacting, or the device that they're using.
Perfect. Now, just as a bit of a preamble, I mean, some of the people that may be, if you like, subscribers to the podcast will recognize the name of Amplexor, and given that you kindly sponsored the podcast in a couple of months ago or a month or so ago, and we that came about because we did a skit as a kickoff for your latest series of online events, which was a lot of fun. So thank you for that. Thank you for the opportunity. We had a lot of fun setting that up.
It was a ton of fun, wasn't it?
It was brilliant. So, but I wanted to invite you onto the podcast to get your perspective on this kind of whole experience thing, and particularly how, as you mentioned, how content and culture and language play a big part in that. But before we do that, I mean, what I wanted to do is we've seen some massive changes over the last kind of few months as a result of the pandemic and so on and so forth. But I wanted to get your kind of take on and your perspective on, so what stood out for you and how have the last few months been for you? Like, what's changed?
Yeah, in a lot of ways, the past 6 to 8 months have felt like years, haven't they? I think you and most of your listeners would agree. So when I consider what has really stood out, I think about the whole cocoon economy and the brands that align with this. home furnishing, kitchenware, bedding,
Right.
do-it-yourself tools and kits, home gyms, streaming media, online gambling, etc.
Mm-hmm.
Loungewear. Oh my gosh. There are 132 million Google results for loungewear. Who would have
Blimey.
guessed that
Blimey.
8 months ago, right?
Why don't you just say track pants? Why do you have to fancy it up, right?
Localization, right?
Right.
So I also think about innovation and adaptability and how
Mm-hmm.
technology has allowed for such flexibility in our lifestyles and in our relationships.
Mm.
Students are using technology for distance learning.
Mm.
Senior citizens are playing bingo via Zoom. Who would have ever thought that?
You're right.
We're using WhatsApp to order takeaway. Business people are networking in new, remote, very creative ways. And of course, the list, goes on and on as we've seen. In terms of transformation, I think the pandemic has forced brands to really accelerate
Right.
their digital transformation. There's lots of data, as you well know,
Mm.
to support this, from end-to-end customer management to the way businesses are fulfilling orders, whether that's online, whether that's curbside. Agility and flexibility is totally the name of the game, and success is dependent, I think we would say, strategic change management.
Mm-hmm.
And I think companies are also getting savvier about the technology
Right.
and all of their integrating tech stacks.
Right.
Um,
So are those the big lessons and takeaways, or I mean, because I mean, that feels like a kind of a big stew of change. I mean, it's almost a bit like all the pieces have moved at once. But what do you
it
think
is, isn't it?
if you were to distill it down? I mean, what do you think the big lessons have been for you and Plexa and what you've seen from your clients? The big sort of takeaways in terms of you know what are the kind of all those like the top three things that you would pull out of all that stew, as it were?
Yeah, right. So this is the stuff that those motivational posters are made of, right?
Yeah, if you like.
Yeah. So, I mean, when I think about what I'm seeing out in the global marketplace, when I think about what I'm seeing in my local community, for me, it boils down to a couple of things: agility,
Hmm.
both personal agility as well as the collective agility.
Right.
I also think being open to learn. So, openness to learning, openness to new things. I also think that we've seen this huge push for sensitivity, more so than ever in our lifetimes, right? Be
Hmm.
sensitive to others' perspectives.
Yes.
Um, and last but not least, stay true to your values, understand and identify what your values are, stay true to them, and embrace the future.
Right. And just want to come back on and one of the first things that you talked about. You talked about agility. Now, agility's been is very well kind of like discussed concept when it comes to organizations. But you talk about personal agility. I mean, that's interesting. Kind of what do you mean by that?
When I think about personal agility, I think about being comfortable in the uncomfortable.
Right.
We are at a point in each of our lives in history
Mm.
where there is no precedent for so many things.
Hmm.
The things that we took for granted yesterday, the way things always were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, the status quo is very dynamic and
Hmm.
changing. And I
Yeah.
think people just have to be, the old adage, go with the flow.
Hmm.
People have to be completely comfortable in that, or you're going to suffer.
Yeah. It's like it's almost like kind of evolution in all caps in many ways, because we know that it's not. People say it was the survival of the fittest, but it wasn't really the survival of the fittest. It was the survival of those that were the most adaptable
Mm-hmm.
in many
Mm-hmm.
ways. And it's almost a bit like feels like you like open your eyes and realize that things are changing and get stuck in.
That's right. It's those nimble trees that weather the storms the best, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So let's get back to kind of like, the area that you guys are that focus on, and so we both know that seeing and understanding the differences between cultures and languages can be the key to delivering a great customer experience. I mean, I know personally I've been sort of, you know, intermittently exploring this on the podcast and in my blog and writings for a while. I mean, um, everything. I remember talking to a lady from Zalando that's based out in Berlin, which is a big e-commerce player here in
Hmm.
Europe,
Yes.
and they talked about these little things and understanding the differences in cultures. And she told me a couple of stories where she said they had to, when they went to expand into Italy, they found that whilst there was a desire to do online shopping, actually up to about 30% of the Italian market is still unbanked. And that produced a huge kind of like challenge for them in terms of their total addressable market, as it were.
Hmm.
And so they had to adapt their operation, their logistical operation, to be able to do cash on delivery,
Sure.
and just so
Yes.
they could actually maximize their total addressable market. And then something like a completely different thing, they also can realize that they run their service and support out of Berlin. They realize
Hmm.
that the Swiss apparently get up an hour earlier than the Germans, and which kind of meant if they wanted to provide the best service to the Swiss market, they had to have their service and support teams for that particular market come in an hour earlier and open their shop, if you like, an hour earlier to be able to, address their needs. So it's all these little kind of like nuances. Um, but what I'm also conscious of is not something that's often talked about. We deal with global kind of brands and things, but it's not something that's often talked about. So, um, can you give us your perspective about what's the keys to success when operating cross-border across multiple languages and cultures? And is it just as simple as having, from your perspective, when you talked about engagement and channels and products and assets and things, is it as simple as having them translated, or is there more to it than that?
Well, I think it's important to remember that only approximately 20% of the people on the internet have English as their native language. So if you think about approximately, let's say, 7.6 billion people on the planet,
Yeah.
current analysts estimate that it takes 19 languages to reach 80% of that world population.
Blimey.
So translating your assets is certainly a step in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
But let's say you're a B2C brand targeting India, China, or Latin America. It's going to require, obviously, a more in-depth effort.
Right.
So translation demonstrates that you care about that specific population or market.
Mm.
But that being said, understanding the local culture and nuances and adapting your content or product is critical.
Right.
Ideally, you want to take a holistic approach to the entire buyer's journey from the user perspective, whether that's researching and purchasing products on an e-commerce site that you
Mm-hmm.
just described, Adrian,
Mm-hmm.
or investing in an e-learning course with various modules and assessments.
Mm-hmm.
Or here's a big one, responding to inquiries, so customer care
Mm.
post-purchase.
Yes.
A lot of people forget about that. So
Mm.
that's a really great one. So when you think about some of the detail that includes, it includes things like localizing or translating the text and the order field. So think about an e-commerce experience
Yeah.
where things like dates and postal addresses and currencies may vary from country to country or region to region.
Mm.
That experience might also include catchy headlines that are meant to invoke certain emotions that
Yeah.
differ from
Mm.
culture to culture, right?
Mm. And so,
Additionally, oh, go
no, no,
ahead.
no, no, no. Please keep going. I mean, you're just giving. I feel like you're just. It's like the to-do list feels like it's quite long, and it feels like it's like actually operating across borders and across languages and cultures. It's like a complex thing.
Oh, and it's getting more complex, right?
Right.
More and more channels are coming onto the scene.
Right.
And
And
also think about videos.
well, exactly, and I guess like simultaneous translation and all of that type of stuff as well. It's
Absolutely.
so
Absolutely. So a number of e-commerce sites, have you noticed the chat function that most e-commerce sites have these days,
Uh-huh.
the really savvy ones, the ones that are truly dedicated to the global marketplace,
Mm.
actually have the multilingual simultaneous chat function.
Yeah, I've seen that, but it's not prevalent really right now.
It will become, I think.
Okay.
The technology is getting smarter and smarter.
And do you think that because it makes me think about that old saying, which is, I don't know when it originated, but people talked about, and like right at the peak of globalization, and people talked about think global and act local. I mean, this is really kind of coming into play more and more now. But I guess my question would be, given all it's not just about language, it's also about culture and cultural nuances and sensitivities and things. So does a globally designed experience always work at a local level? And if not, kind of like, what should brands be looking out for? Some of the big sort of like, if you like, potholes or tripwires, as it were, that you've experienced.
So this is a really intriguing question, and I think the response lies in knowing thy customer.
Mm.
How and where they search for your products or solutions, the search engines they use.
Right.
There are several countries who rely on search engines other than Google. I think a
Okay.
lot of companies either don't know that or perhaps they forget.
Right.
The keywords that target audiences are using. Some users typing on a keyboard or using voice search.
Right.
Which is it?
Mm-hmm.
Voice search is becoming more and more prevalent. It's certainly gaining in popularity. So how does the research and evaluation differ from the actual purchase from
Right.
one market to another?
Okay.
For instance, does the audience research products on their mobile device and then go to their desktop to make the actual purchase? We see this a lot, right?
Right.
Or perhaps they do research on an iPad and then go into a store to make
Right.
the actual purchase. And we see that for things like jeans, right? For those people who are still wearing jeans rather than loungewear. Or to purchase a car.
Sure.
Though we see users in China, changing the model, changing the habits there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Cars and some of those big durable items are things that are being bought on the internet these days
Mm-hmm.
without sight unseen, shall we say.
Yes.
So when we think about language, I see language as the most basic form of personalization, and it plays a huge role.
Yes. I
So
love that.
going back to your question, balancing that global experience with that local relevance, it's a term in our industry that we refer to as glocal.
Right.
And it's a really challenging balancing act, even for the world's largest, most sophisticated global companies.
Yeah. So I mean, it's you say it's a challenge, and it sounds like a massive kind of challenge. But do you have a couple of examples of clients, firms that you've worked with, brands that you've worked with, that you could share with us that illustrate some of the insightful, the creative, and impactful things that they've done, and what has been the impact for them, just to kind of illustrate, almost like um, uh, the benefits of putting the effort in to actually kind of and getting it right, and what they did to get it right.
Oh my goodness, there are so many. Some of the ones that immediately come to mind include the complete localization of a leading virtual communications platform that
Okay.
Amplexer has helped expand into multiple emerging markets during COVID.
Right.
Let's think about it. Going back to that world population, I don't know how many are communicating on platforms such as the one we're on today,
Uh-huh.
but that whole experience has to be, you know, outfitted, if you will, adapted
Mm-hmm.
for that particular culture. And Amplexer has helped one of the leaders in that market to do just that. Another one that comes to mind is our support of a global online gambling conglomerate that manages more than 30 distinct online gambling sites across more than 60 multiple markets.
Wow.
We've just helped them launch a new sports gambling experience.
Mm-hmm.
Another one that comes to mind is a German-based online dating brand. People are
Like,
lonely out there, right? The virtual introductions require extreme cultural adaptation. So yet another company that we are in the process of helping. Or going back to the people, God love them, the DIY power tool users.
you go.
Think about all of the instructions that come with those tools. And some of the people during COVID are using these tools for the very first time ever.
Mm-hmm.
So
And
those instructions, that experience, it has to be localized for their
and
particular language and culture.
so I'm interested in some of the actual cultural adaptation some of these brands have had to undertake. I mean, like you say, the particularly the German one, because you mentioned in particular the cultural adaptation that they had to undergo. Could you give us an insight into kind of what sort of things that they did to adapt their experience?
Yeah, absolutely. So even though the company is a German-based company,
Mm-hmm.
they are a global brand.
Right.
And in terms of the introductions that they are looking to help facilitate, it's a cross-border effort, if you will,
Uh-huh.
right?
Mm-hmm.
People want to meet people in other countries. So when you think about the descriptions, how you give the bio, I'm personally not on any dating sites, but
Neither am I. I hasten to add, I'm happily married.
yes. But as we know, there are descriptions and biographies that
Mm-hmm.
require adaptation, ways of communicating, whether that be simultaneous chat or whatever.
Right.
But that whole experience needs to be facilitated, and language is at the core of
Right.
all of that.
Awesome. Um, I mean, is there any other kind of like examples of, you mentioned gaming and you mentioned a communication platform and DIY tools. I mean, any other examples of the particular examples around the adaptation that some of these brands have undertaken? Just because it's like, I think for me, it's like it's all very well talking about nuances and differences and
Hmm.
then adapting to them, but actually the stories that we kind of hear, whether it's the one that I shared with you about Zalando and the Swiss market and the Italian market, and how
Hmm.
people have had to adapt. I mean, what specifically are some of these kind of, let's say, the gaming company or the communication platform or the DIY tools? What did the DIY tools one? You talked about the different instructions, and that makes sense. What about the gaming companies or the communication platform? What anything, any particular sort of adaptation that they did that stood out for you?
Absolutely. And I think it comes down to a lot of marketing language, right?
Right.
If
Okay.
you're a really great marketer, the language is intended to invoke emotion.
Right.
And if we're more specific to that, there is a call to action to progress them along a buyer journey toward either purchase or repeat purchase,
Mm-hmm.
right? It's all about engagement.
Right.
And, without getting into all of the technical details of translation, I think translation, for those who are not involved in it and perhaps looking from the outside in, it appears to be a very simple kind of conversion effort.
Mm-hmm.
One language to another, not a lot of thought, right?
Mm-hmm.
But when you think about the source and what it took to create that source,
Mm-hmm.
there are typically multiple writers, there are editors, there are people reviewing, there might be some test marketing happening. The same should hold true for the target language.
Yes.
And I think a lot of companies look at that very naively
Yeah.
and think of it as a simple conversion when literally there are 10 or 15 ways, methodologies, if you will,
Mm-hmm.
to convert one language to another. And it's a fascinating space.
I think so. I mean, it always reminds me of there was the impact of language across different kind of cultures is fascinating, particularly when you just use a translation thing. I mean, it reminds me of there was a car back in I guess it was maybe the 1980s that was produced by Vauxhall here in the UK, and it was called a Nova,
Oh, yes.
Nova, which didn't do particularly well in Spanish speaking kind of markets, because you end up with a car
Right.
kind of called
Nova.
doesn't go when it translates.
Mm-hmm.
And that was just one of those kind of massive, if
Mm-hmm.
you like, blunders,
Mm-hmm.
and Nova in English and or kind of with its Latin root kind of means it's almost like a shooting kind of like star, something that has movement in
Mm-hmm.
it. So it implies movement.
Mm-hmm.
But when you translate it into Spanish, it just has this very, different kind of like
Negative connotation.
exactly. And I guess it's
Mm-hmm.
all those kind of things. That's just like a very simple example, but that's
Mm-hmm.
something you say that's about branding and naming. But
Mm-hmm.
actually, you have to kind of think it's not just about branding and naming. That's maybe the tip of the iceberg. But then it's like almost to do with everything that you say and how you say it, and hence it's not just a simple translation kind
Well,
of
and even
angle.
moving beyond words, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
would like to say that we are now in an era where those bloopers don't happen,
Mm-hmm.
but they actually do.
Sure.
And, I'm not going to call out any brands, here in public,
No.
but there was a very visible one just a few weeks ago related to some Arabic advertising for a
Right.
big DIY company.
Okay.
But it goes beyond the words, right? It goes and includes things like color choice.
Yeah.
We know that colors, like red and white and black,
Mm-hmm.
these have very strong meanings and very strong connotations depending upon the culture.
Sure.
Same with graphics, right? You want to be very careful.
And image
Um,
choice as well.
Absolutely, graphics and image. There are still a lot of cultures that are very, very sensitive to gender,
Yes.
and, again, depending upon the product or service that a person is marketing or a company is marketing, you just have to be sensitive about the entire experience
Mm-hmm.
and what emotions could be drawn or evoked
Yeah.
from that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, I guess again, the only way that you talked about going before you talked about agility, and I guess getting this right is going to have to be a process of testing and learning, I guess.
Hmm.
And because you have to, there's it's worth spending the time to get it right rather than actually kind of like putting your foot in it, and that which might take a little bit more kind of time and might run kind of counter to that whole speed to market and things. But actually, I think it's less speed, more was it less haste, more speed is the old saying.
Mm.
But now, like you, Alison, I've been kind of like thinking about all this sort of stuff that's been changing around us, and I know that we've talked before and about this, but I wanted to do this kind of like actually as part of the podcast. Is that we discussed a piece that I wrote a little while ago that explored these like four different imperatives that I saw emerging out of the impact of the pandemic, and that was um, protection and resilience and experience in its multiple dimensions. And I'm forgetting what the fourth one was. Um,
Did you say resilience?
protection, resilience. Oh,
Learning?
uh, learning. Thank you. So I'll record that again. So let me go back. Oh crumbs! I forget what I wrote. Um, so thank you for that, Alison. Now, like you, I've been thinking a lot about what's been changing around us, kind of just by almost like standing on the sidelines in many ways and just kind of observing. And I know we've talked about it before, but I wanted to kind of to discuss it a little bit on the podcast. As I wrote this piece a little while ago that explored what I saw as four different imperatives that I saw emerging out of the impact of the COVID pandemic. And those four things were learning and resilience and protection and experience, and how experiences are multidimensional. And I wanted to just get your perspective on kind of that. I mean, are you seeing some of the same things emerge? And if so, Which ones, if any, kind of resonate the most with you, and why?
Yes, we discussed this during Amplexer's Ignite Revenue Through Content's
Mm-hmm.
first episode, and I was so inspired by your insights. Truthfully, they all resonate, and Amplexer has seen many of the same things.
Mm-hmm.
Particularly when you combine the global pandemic with some of the social issues,
Sure.
such as Black Lives Matter and law
Mm-hmm.
enforcement injustices.
Yeah.
So if I had to pick two, I would emphasize learning.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about this a little bit earlier on, but now more than ever, we need to be open to learning
Mm-hmm.
from one another, from our failures, and letting go of what may have worked in the past.
Yeah.
It's an era where no single company or individual or government has the perfect answers.
Sure.
So experiment often, fail often, and encourage an open mind and heart. So that would be the first one, learning.
Mm-hmm.
And I think secondly, I would select experience.
Mm-hmm.
And as we know, experience encompasses that 360-degree view of all stakeholders.
Yeah.
So how do transformation and new strategies affect your employees, your leadership team, your customers, both present and future, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm an optimist, and from what I've seen, it's evident that most companies are doing their utmost to keep all of their constituents whole,
Mm-hmm.
whether it's continued employment during a recession or this pandemic, whether it's nurturing employees beyond the typical workday,
Yeah.
whether it's offering discounts to their customers, etc.
Mm-hmm.
But I think experience and just having that full circle view of all of your stakeholders and constituents, and just ensuring that everyone is engaged, and again, moving forward, preferably with the same mission in mind.
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, no, it's great. I just thought the what's fascinating is it's almost as if particularly on the experience side of things, it's almost a bit like what's happened over the last few months has made is below. People talk about customer experience and people talk about employee experience, and a lot of the time the conversation is almost quite disaggregated.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually think we need to kind of, as you say, kind of like actually just talk about experience, and
Mm-hmm.
then actually start having a holistic conversation about it, and a
Mm-hmm.
holistic strategy, because I don't think you can do it piecemeal. I think it has to
No,
be kind of all considered.
agreed.
Perfect. So what I also kind of like to do on these in these interviews is is to ask the people that I'm kind of speaking to is to kind of boil things down from their perspective, because as well as I do, we talked about learning. One of the things about learning is people like to get things boiled down to you know quick kind of tips or advice, or also just want kind of like a quick nudge in terms of how to get started, or the fastest way to get started. So if I was to say to you, for someone listening to this or reading the highlights and they want to deliver a better service or a better experience to their customers and their employees, I mean, what would be your bestest advice? Where should they start?
Okay, here we go.
Uh-huh.
Know thy customer. I mentioned it earlier.
In
Know thy customer.
big capital letters.
Absolutely. It doesn't matter if this is an external customer or an internal employee, colleague, manager, etc., shareholder.
Mhm.
Know unequivocally what is important to each of
Mhm.
those customers.
Yeah.
Is it immediacy? We touched on that. Is it responsiveness?
Mhm.
Is it personalization? Whatever it is, keep the experience and the interactions real and transparent.
Mhm.
We're all familiar with the phrase, keep it real, right?
Mhm.
When it comes to experience, it is so, so poignant. And last but not least, ensure that the experience is seamless across all multiple touch points.
Perfect. I mean, and on the first one, um, I guess I might on like know thy customer. I mean, or know thy stakeholder, know thy constituents. let's say. What would you advocate that kind of people kind of do to better do that? I mean, because I like this idea of, and I've been exploring this idea of starting to call myself a service or experience anthropologist.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Love that.
just because the anthropology requires kind of like study and observation and analysis of data and all that sort of stuff, but it actually requires you also to be with people,
Mm-hmm.
to see it from their perspective. And so I guess my question would be, when you say know thy customer or know thy constituent, as it were, um, we need to go beyond the data, don't we?
Oh, completely. The data only tells part of the story, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think the real knowledge comes from experiencing that. I don't want to say experiencing that experience, but spending time from that role's point of view.
Mm.
So if you are working within a company, spend time as a customer or a potential customer,
Mm.
looking at the brand or the experience from the outside in. How easy is the company to do business with?
Mm-hmm.
On the inside, spend time with the front line. What friction are they experiencing on a day-to-day basis that is serving as a hurdle to doing the absolute best for customers?
Mm-hmm.
So spending time in each of those roles that we discussed, middle management,
Mm-hmm.
what administrative tasks or reports or, whatever, what are they spending time on that is taking time away from bettering the relationship and experience with the customer?
Perfect.
And from an executive point of view, I think the more time that you can spend in those roles, the better off the company's going to be.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, the more profitable the company will be. And there's lots of data to support that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was just talking to somebody earlier today, and I was talking about this idea that you know, tell me what you think about this. Is probably quite a radical idea, but if leaders want to take that or be able to do that, I think they have to consider doing two kind of like probably fairly radical things, and that's one, um, redeploying their personal assistants who control their diaries, um, to another part of the business, and so therefore they can take control of their time again.
Yes.
And the second thing is to be willing to arbitrarily cancel um, at least 20% of the meetings that they're going to be in every week, so they can free up time to do this sort of work.
Yes. Open up the margins, as I say.
Yeah.
Open up the white space.
What do you think? I mean, do you think? I mean, it's probably quite a radical idea, but for me, I think that that's sort of part of kind of like what is required in many ways.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you know what that reminds me of?
Mm-hmm.
It reminds me of preparing for a big global voyage or trip.
Mm-hmm.
The most efficient packers will pack their suitcase and then remove 30% of what they've packed.
There you go.
You know what? I do the same thing every Sunday evening as I prepare for my week ahead.
Mm-hmm.
I will look at my meeting schedule for the week ahead,
Mm-hmm.
and I will arbitrarily cancel or decline 30% of the meeting invites.
Nice. You are a punk, Alison. You are a punk.
You inspire me, Adrian. I'm trying.
Thank you. So let's kind of project forward a little bit. Now we've talked about kind of where we are right now, but for you and from your perspective, I mean, what is the kind of what does the future of service and experience kind of look like, from your perspective, and what are some of the key challenges that you think are coming down the track for many kind of big brands and organizations?
Yeah, we've got to get this language thing figured out.
Right.
The internet has proven that languages are not going away. that actually more languages are coming to light, and many of the old languages are successfully being preserved. It's a beautiful thing.
Mm-hmm.
But companies have to get this language thing figured out, and it's hard.
Yeah.
Additionally, what I'm seeing here in the United States, and this is really interesting, and I have not seen this anywhere else, so this idea is mine.
Mm-hmm.
We're seeing a different language across the generations.
Right.
And I noticed this with my two daughters who happen to be Generation Z or Gen
Mm-hmm.
Zers. They will speak a different language amongst themselves and then sort of formalize it with the Gen Xers or with the older generations. So we're seeing language differences even amongst the generations, which I think is fascinating.
Wow.
We've got to get that figured out.
Mm-hmm.
And I also think that we have to get this fulfillment situation figured out. I think Amazon is doing a really great job, but we're seeing postal services that are struggling. I don't know. I don't know what the answer is to that logistical issue,
Mm-hmm.
but we've got to get that streamlined across the world
Yeah.
and, of course, within certain countries.
Perfect. I mean, yeah, because I think what's, the reality is that I think that whilst, governments might want to get as many people as possible back to work and back
Mm-hmm.
into towns and cities, I
Yep.
think many businesses are seeing the benefits from the shift that has taken place, and the idea of increased remote working or hybrid operations and streamlined building infrastructure in particular
Mm-hmm.
is here to stay. It feels like, because I think many kind of like businesses have realized as well, if we can operate the way that we can operate on a without requiring kind of bums on seats, as it were,
Mm-hmm.
then why wouldn't we? For all sorts of different reasons, and so there's a changed reality that feeds to that sort of logistical sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And even some of those very traditional, in-person businesses, you know, telemedicine, telehealth comes
Mm-hmm.
immediately to mind,
Mm-hmm.
when you were describing this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where we're now scheduling conference calls with our doctors,
Yeah.
scheduling video calls with our nurses.
Mm-hmm.
That being said, you still have to go in to get your flu shot.
Yeah.
Until there's a way for them to drive through neighborhoods and deliver door to door. I don't know what that delivery, that fulfillment operation, how that's going to evolve, like I mentioned, but I think that there's a lot of opportunity for innovation.
Oh yeah. I mean, if you think about it from a perspective of like, think about somebody who's a diabetic, and they self medicate and take their insulin shot and things, and there's
Mm-hmm.
dispensing devices that they use. I think there's good practice out there. It's whether or not that can be applied across different domains.
Right.
Perfect.
Right.
So wow, some big challenges. So um, Alison, thank you for all that. But if I may, just to kind of round things off on a bit of a fun note, and you know this because you've got your copies of kind of like Punk CX. I've been through the course of the last year, I've been asking people at the end of these interviews. I'm doing a bit. It's like a bit of ongoing social research, where I've been asking them to do a word association kind of game with me. And so what I've been doing is ask them two questions. First one is, what one word do you think would describe a more punk approach to customer experience or just experience? And so what would that one or two words be?
The one word that comes to my mind is memorable.
Memorable. Perfect. I will make a note of that because I have a big list and for that. And then the second question is there a company or brand that you think epitomizes a more punk approach to experience?
Yes, and actually, it is one here in the US that comes to mind, and I've loved watching how they respond to the pandemic. And that company is Chipotle Mexican Grill. I don't think
Okay.
you have them in the UK, Adrian.
No, I don't think so.
This is a company dedicated to very healthy burritos.
Okay.
And with the onset of the pandemic, this company has completely transitioned. They are dedicated to getting burritos to people however they can, delivery, drive-through, curbside, you name it.
Mm-hmm.
And additionally, as you can probably imagine, most of their workers and customers are Gen Z,
Right.
people in their early 20s.
Mm-hmm.
They have people who will go out onto Twitter and just hang out, or go onto a Google Hangout and just be there to talk to their customers about whatever is on their minds.
Right. That's
You
awesome.
know, it's kind of like online mental health for Gen Z, and I just love it.
Well, yeah, and I think that's great because I think you touch on a subject that that is I think many people are talking about, but I think we've yet to see the full impact of is the mental health dimension, the mental
Mhm.
health impact of the pandemic, and it's not just because of the pandemic, because mental health is a real and serious issue and continuous issue, but I think it's been exacerbated by the things we've had to do to get a handle on the virus. So
Yeah,
it's heartwarming to hear Chipotle kind of like getting stuck in about that, and
yeah.
that's to be commended. Awesome. So, Alison, that's all I have today. I mean, unless there's something else you want to kind of discuss, like current affairs or something like that. But if not, then
I think we need another session.
maybe that's going to need to be a private session. Who knows? Um, but I just want to say thank you for inviting me onto the Implaxor kind of series. That was such a lot of fun. I also want to say thank you for joining me today on the podcast and sharing your insight and your experience. I mean, that's been kind of awesome.
Well, thank you, Adrian. It's been a real honor to be here, and I really appreciate the invitation.
Well, that was cool. I hope you enjoyed it. I did, and I always do actually, because I always learn something new when I speak to some of these amazing kind of people. And it's always something new that I can incorporate into my writing, speaking, workshops, and other sort of advisory work that I do. Now, if you're interested in learning about any of that sort of stuff, then you can find out more about how I work with clients over at adrianswinscoe.com. One final thing before I go, please consider heading over to iTunes or Spotify or whichever podcast platform you choose to use, and do leave a review. Every little helps, as they say. Anyway, that's all for now. Thank you for listening, and do tune in again soon. All the very best. Cheers. Bye.